Right, good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll make a start. It's just 12:20. Welcome to this session. My name is Robert Devereux. I'm the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Transport, and I'm also head of the policy profession for the Civil Service. And joining me today is David Bell, who's the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Education. It's just 8 weeks since the election. For some of us, it feels more like 8 months, but it is actually only 8 weeks. I counted it up today. In that 8 weeks, we have several things we should be proud of. First of all, as many of you will have heard, I hope, directly from ministers, the government is actually very pleased with what they found in the civil service. The degree of preparation that we did before we got to the election has served us very well, both in the transition itself, but also in all the work that we've done subsequently. But this is an opportunity today that we'd like to take to say, well, we spent slightly more time with ministers than many of you will have done just because it's the nature of the first few weeks. So it provides a bit of an opportunity for us to sort of play back to you some of the things that we've learnt about the Coalition's priorities, getting underneath that a bit, sort of the way they approach issues, how they think about things. Now, to that end, I can speak for my Secretary of State, David can speak for his, but you'll get the gist of it. And then what I hope to do is to take that out into, and what does that mean for you and the way that we all need to work with the Coalition. So that's the nature of the session. So if you think you're at a different session, please leave now, because otherwise you'll be disappointed. I'm going to do it in 3 pieces, if I may. I'm going to just talk to you briefly about one critical thing, which is around deficit reduction, which is clearly a big priority on which I've learned quite a bit from my Secretary of State. If you know, my Secretary of State is Philip Hammond. He was, in opposition, the Shadow Chief Secretary, so he actually knows more than a thing or two about spending. Then I'm going to have a conversation with David around some of the rather more difficult issues to get your head around localism and the big society, and what does that mean for the way government operates. And then we'll end with a session where you can actually ask us anything, either about what we've spoken about, or if you've got some other pressing issues you want to talk to either of us about, please do. So that's the nature of it. We have 1 hour, and I hope you find it useful. I want to start, though, with the coalition agreement. I'm hoping that by now you've all have seen this and had a chance to have a look at it. It's a pretty remarkable document, partly just because it was written in quite short order, but it is fundamentally the foundation of what the coalition is all around. So these are the things they want to do, and the flip side of that, obviously, is that this is the yardstick against which the government is going to be measured come the election in 5 years' time. It's got a lot of things in it. It took me a long time to work out why transport, which is obviously very important, comes second to last, until I realised it's done alphabetically. And whether it was conscious or not, the consequence of doing it alphabetically means that everything in here starts with banking. Now, I think that is a bit of an unconscious sort of moment, but there you go. There's a lot of things in it, and well worth a read if you haven't seen it already. But also, very well worth reading the bit that goes at the back. There's a little green panel at the back of this document, and basically what it says is, however important all the other pages are, the most important thing for you to understand is that deficit reduction is the overarching priority. Everything else is second to achieving that. And you'll be as familiar as I am with the way in which the government has actually addressed itself to the economic situation that we're in and what the consequences that has for the whole of public spending. What I thought I'd like to do today is just to run through the way in which that overarching commitment has actually played into our lives and what we have to do. First of all, very obviously, it shaped 2 of the very big events, even in the first 8 weeks. So we have now managed to make adjustments to planned spending for the current year, which has reduced total spending by £6 billion. My department has put up 683 of those, every pound in a hard won in a conversation with the Treasury. And then only a fortnight ago, you had the budget, which was setting out not just the tax position, but also the public spending position for the whole of the rest of the Parliament. It's those numbers over 4 years for spending which produces the headlines you've seen around, on average, a 25% real reduction for most departments, other than those that are protected like health and overseas aid. However you look at it, those are really large reductions. Now, if you think about it for two minutes, there's only about 3 things which government can do to make change in the real world. It can spend money, it can write laws and regulate, and it can influence. And if actually, in the spending arena, we're going to be seeing 25% real reductions, or maybe it's 40%. You've seen what the arithmetic we're trying to do. The spending element, what you can achieve with a checkbook, is clearly going to be heavily constrained. But at the same time, if you look under regulation in the coalition agreement, you'll find that the government has got an equally aggressive agenda about regulation. Every new regulation that's put on the statute book, they want another one withdrawn, the so-called one-in, one-out rule. We're still working through the detail of exactly how that works, and you can understand why civil servants could spend hours and hours trying to define what one-in, one-out means, when on the face of it, it's pretty straightforward. But nonetheless, what you see then is if there is an agenda of spending, regulation, and influencing, spending is constrained, regulation is constrained. You can see why the government is interested in influencing. Influencing takes a variety of forms, but to give you two examples that we're already fairly familiar with, the Change for Life programme that the Department for Health has been running, the Think campaign for road safety that my department has been running, these are in the space where actually we're trying to engage with people and change behaviours without spending large quantities of money and without regulation. If those are if that's my stall of the three things which you might think about, let me just focus in on some of the things that I've learnt about the way the government approaches these things and just think a little bit about what it might mean for us. Let me start with spending, first of all. Perhaps the most obvious thing to say is actually I've been particularly struck by the extent of attention which ministers are spending to what is being spent and why. I was going to have a little competition to see who is aware of the smallest number which any minister has actually opined on in terms of spending. In my department, it's £14,000. I've discussed £14,000 with the Secretary of State. I can't remember doing that with the previous Secretary of State. If you think about why they're in that space, I don't know if any of you saw the stuff in The Economist a little while back that said there's only 4 kinds of spending in the world. There's money that I spend myself. It's my money being spent on me. There's my money being spent on somebody else. There's somebody else's money being spent on me. And last of all, there's somebody else's money being spent on somebody else. Virtually the whole of government spending is in the last category. And you can see by that quick analogy why it is that actually there's always a risk that we sort of forget quite what it is that's going on. One of my staff said we ought to put a banner in the buildings just when you walk in, and it just says, it's other people's money, as a way of just sort of getting it in. Now, the new government has arrived and has got a really strong sort of attention to exactly what's going on. And it's coupled with a really important thought, which I'll share with you, because it's helped me understand quite where they're coming from. It's what my secretary described to me as it's 1942. What he means by that is, if you were in 1942, in the middle of a war, you would be thinking about all manner of things that you'd be prepared to do with one eye on victory, which you simply wouldn't contemplate in sort of peacetime environment. And so his observation essentially is the depth of the crisis, but in the economy and in the public spending, is such that ministers need to be thinking really radically about all the things they're prepared to do in order to get that situation to come right. So the Think 1942 is quite a good way of understanding why ministers are coming at things the way they are. The second thing, which I think is worth picking up on spending that I've learnt at least, is that they're not really interested in just cutting spending and at the same time slashing outputs at the same time. So, I mean, I've had several conversations with my Secretary of State, which are actually quite difficult to do in some respects, where he's asking me, well, what's the unit cost of all this stuff? I don't just want to see the totals going down. I want to know what I'm buying with it, right? So the sort of question I've been asked is, what is the bus subsidy per mile in the north of England? What is train subsidy for coming into London? Now, actually, I know what these numbers are in total. We have not sort of historically tried to think our way through in sort of a unit price way. It was quite the rigour, that my Secretary of State is thinking about. And so if you want another sort of hot tip about things to think about, is if you think about a budget, worry about what's being spent on it, right? I think my Secretary of State at least frets that in a world where actually everything is controlled in big annual budgets, and whatever the Treasury says, we're still a fairly annualised sort of institution. The risk is that people get used to managing aggregates over the course of a year and take their eye off exactly what's happening in terms of things slipping to the right or costing slightly more. So long as it comes in on budget overall, isn't that okay? Now, as a counting officer, obviously, I lay awake worrying about that anyway, but it's been reinforced over the last few weeks by simply seeing the way my Secretary of State goes about it. The third thing, which he's come back to time and time again, which I think is really quite a helpful thing to think about, is actually all the money that we're spending, particularly through contracts and various other other mechanisms like that. Please would you think, he says, about asking the supplier to comment on the specification that you're setting out. He's very anxious that actually what we've got used to in a world of lots of cash and a lot of prescriptive top-down targets is sort of, we know what we're about, we write it down, and we ask somebody to price it. It comes back with a number, we pay it. That's his characterisation of the way he worries about the way the civil service operates. Now, you may know that you do better than that, but I think it's worth just clocking that that's where he is. The contrary view that he's interested in is actually, well, what are you doing to sit down with the people that you're spending money through and saying to them, well, what is it about this specification which, if I were to change it, I might be able to get a better price without really bringing an end to the outputs? It's a question you can ask at every single layer in a government department about any amount of spending. Actually, how do you know that the thing you've asked for is the right thing, and who are you asking to check? All right? Then the fourth thing I just want to come on to is a slightly more profound thing, which you'll see in some of the stuff that's come out in the spending review, which is essentially to ask the question, why are you spending money in the first place? What's the role of government? So if you come back to the point that I made earlier about money being tight and regulation being limited, let me come back to the stuff about influencing. I don't know how many of you have ever picked up this book, which has been recommended for a while now, called Nudge. It's one of those books which actually is much better at the front than it is at the end, if you ask me, but that's a good suggestion. You read the first half. The point about this is that one of the authors here, Thala, is actually now part of the central government in the Cabinet Office, actually working with a team of individuals, working with departments to think about different ways of doing things. Let me give you an example of one of the things that's in here, just to give you an idea about it. They did some experiments in California about energy usage in households, right? So we've got a big carbon reduction plan. We're interested in people using less energy. In the States, they simply gave people the bill they're always used to, and alongside it illustrated what the average usage was for households in the same neighbourhood. They simply showed the average in the neighbourhood. What that did was it produced much lower energy usage by the high usage people, because they could see that their number was north of the number for the average, and they started to reduce it. Even more amazingly, if you ask me, for those people that had a bill printed with a smiley face, a happy face if you were under the average and a sad face if you're over the average, there was an even greater reduction in energy consumption. Now, if you think about it just for 2 minutes, as an institution, we're not used to thinking that smiley faces might just be the way in which to change behaviour. Our natural inclination is to either get out my checkbook or to get out my law book. And here is an illustration that says, hang on a minute, maybe a smiley face might. Now, I've no idea what might work in your area, and we simply don't have time today to go through all the sort of things that go into behavioural change. So let me just use this as a plug to say that during the course of the autumn, from September onwards, the policy profession is going to be running half-day and one-day events to actually go into some of the things that David and I are talking about during the course of today in a little bit more depth, so you get a chance to engage with some of these thoughts and see where you are. So let me just summarise where I've got to then. As far as one critical priority is concerned then, deficit reduction is right up there. It is the overarching responsibility. That comes with very tight spending limits. The things which I think you'll be well worth just reflecting on if you want some sort of practical tips in this world, I've got 4 really I've run through. They're not the only ones, but there are 4 to do it. One of which is think 1942. Be prepared to ask really hard questions. Be prepared to ask impertinent questions of the people that you work for. Think 1942. Second one, please understand unit costs. Make sure that what you're doing is actually reflecting the difference between what you're getting as well as what you're spending. Third, the bit about thinking hard about the specification that you write down. If you're thinking about doing something, work out who else you could ask to see whether there's a better way of specifying it and thus get decent outcomes for a better price. And fourth, please keep thinking about what are the alternatives to actually spending and regulating in the first place. The whole stuff around how can you change behaviour otherwise. Now, those 4 come out of a sort of pretty straightforward sort of comprehension of the spending challenge and some of the things that people may have to engage with. But if you've listened to the rhetoric of the government and read the whole of the coalition document, there is actually a rather bigger question out there as well, which is actually, why is the government acting at all? And what I'd like to do now is actually turn to David and ask him some questions, because if you've gathered what's going on in education and the way that's being changed, there's quite a... You ready now, eh? There are some really good examples in here of what this completely different approach might seem like. So let me just try this, and I'll get some water at the same time.
Robert, I was just thinking that colleagues in the room might not know that I began life as a primary school teacher and was the head of a primary school, so I know that smiley faces change behaviour.
Okay. So the thing I'd like to start with is that if you remember the world of education under the previous government, it was characterised by an awful lot of top-down targets. And so I guess the first question is, what does this government think it's going to try to achieve by, in a sense, taking all those away?
I think it's a really interesting question.
That's
because
good,
that's a very good question. And I didn't even know it was coming. I think you're right. The previous government believed strongly that you had to set targets to really drive change in the system. And I think it's fair to say that if you look back to the early days of the previous administration in 1997, target trade did act as an important galvanizing force. We had become too used to expecting or accepting a certain level of performance. And unless you thought that something else was achievable, you weren't even going to do anything about it. So I think that was very important. But I think we all know in this room that over time, targets perhaps run out of their usefulness, and or you get a whole set of perverse consequences. So I think this government is less interested in what you might describe as outcome targets, as far as we can understand it. So whilst we might still be interested in it and concerned about the number of children who achieve a certain percentage of GCSE passes at a particular grade, or percentage of children who achieve a grade at the end of primary school, I think this government's view is, no, we should be less interested in that and more interested in creating the framework for schools, head teachers, teachers, to, as it were, bring about their own improved outcomes. So don't impose them from the centre, but create a framework, greater devolution, more freedom, less bureaucracy, and allows schools to really get on with the job, and then only intervene where you have extreme failure. So I think that's how it's shaping up. I wouldn't conclude, Robert, in education or elsewhere, that that's yet the definitive position of the government, because we know that during the spending review there's going to be conversations about the new style performance framework. But at the moment, much more interest in creating frameworks and allowing frontline institutions to get on with the job.
I guess I understand that. The bit I'm not too sure about is in 18 months' time, when somebody asks the parliamentary question and says what proportion of students got a GCSE at a certain level, and hypothesise the number is not gone up or it's gone down, how do you think you're going to draft the answer to that, PQ?
With difficulty, presumably. I think that, well, a couple of ways into that. First of all, that information will still be available. And the government, as we've all seen, has placed a great premium on transparency. And the more data, the better. And your comments about unit costs, I think, were extremely well made, because we're going to see more and more of that kind of micro-level data being required. So all of that will be out there, and people will be able to make their judgments. I think this is one of the unanswered questions, to be frank, and I suspect that's what the performance framework discussions during spending review will address. What will the government's reaction be if, at the end of a particular period, outcomes haven't gone in the upwards direction? I personally can't believe that governments would have no interest in that, because presumably, after all, if you stood for election and you've got a policy programme and you have a coalition agreement in this particular case, you're going to want to be able to say, since we came to power, things have improved, things have changed, things are better. I think the question is, what kinds of measures might you use to determine whether things have got better, and whether you as the government will consider it appropriate that you take responsibility or not for improved outcomes. Because one could say that if you increase transparency, and we'll talk a bit, I'm sure, in a moment about diversifying the number of people who provide education, you have inspection arrangements and you publish tables and all of that, the pressure will come from below in individual schools and possibly to the school system generally, if you haven't seen these improved outcomes. But I do think this is a very interesting question, Robert, where we don't yet have a settled position from the government.
Okay. So, I mean, I think I spent at least 7 years as a governor of my kids' school. All these schools have got some form of parental engagement at the moment. What more do you think the government is expecting in a sort of big society sense from the bottom up in education?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for your contribution to the big society by being a school governor, and there are plenty of vacancies around the country. So if you want to make an active contribution, colleagues, to the big society, go and volunteer to be a school governor. Yes, parents are quite substantially involved, and in fact it's been one of the quiet revolutions of the past 20 years. I mean, you were part of it, obviously, that actually a huge number, literally hundreds of thousands of people, have volunteered to participate in the life and work of their local school. And that's been a great contribution. I think the government would say that's good, but we would want to open up the opportunities for parents and others to create their own schools. And therefore, one of the policy announcements already of the Secretary of State is to create what's called the free schools. In other words, where parents and others can put together a proposition, and if they want to create a school and can demonstrate through a quite simple business case that they should be enabled to do so, then there'll be funding in that direction. And one of the arguments in favour of the free schools approach is that rather than think of saying we must have a 200-place primary school and it must be in a building of this sort and this type, we're actually going to have a much more liberal regime, small L liberal regime, to enable parents and others who want to set up new schools, perhaps to use previously used retail accommodation or office accommodation, sometimes residential accommodation if people so choose. So the planning regulations have been relaxed to allow that to happen. So I think there's not an assumption there that everyone currently with a child in the state system will think this is not good enough, I need to have my child somewhere else, but just simply a way of increasing further parents' freedom to create new schools. And also I think, frankly, Robert, to provide more stimulus to the improvement of everyone else. So to use that ghastly jargon, the diversification of supply, more people out there providing schools, giving greater choice to parents and to children and young people, then having a sort of ratcheting up effect on standards.
Okay. So if we've both sort of started to dismantle the top-down targets and at the same time trying to encourage more sort of localism in that supply, that seems like a radically different agenda to the one your staff were previously on. Mm-hmm. So how have you helped them to get to grips with this, and what lessons would you then offer everybody else as a consequence?
Yeah, I mean, just before I answer that specific question, I think the way you described it is absolutely right, but of course one of the consequences has been that quite a lot of the bits in the middle are being dismantled. Mm-hmm. We had set up, as a number of colleagues might know and perhaps experience of in their own departments, a whole set of non-departmental public bodies and other intermediary bodies between the national state and the local institution, whether that's a school or the children's centre or the further education college. And I know that in opposition, certainly Michael Gove was very critical of what he called the intermediate state, because he felt that all that was doing was getting in the way of what frontline providers should be doing. Mm-hmm. It was an unnecessary overhead, and it was costing far too much money. And actually, just by its very existing, it was creating lots of work for people to do that wasn't very necessary. Mm-hmm. So I think it's been a consequence of this shift that you described, Robert, that this intermediate state will be going. And we've already had 3 of our non-departmental public bodies announced for abolition, and I think it's fair to say that that's probably not the end of that programme. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, that plays right into your question of how our staff used to operate. Because our colleagues were very used to working with non-departmental public bodies and using them at the same time as they were used to drafting regulations and guidance and all the other things that I think a more activist state did under the previous administration. And it's not been straightforward. I mean, we try to prepare our staff well in advance by thinking through that this new government, should there be a change of government, might want to do things differently. I think we've adjusted pretty well, but sometimes people are finding it hard to understand that all those things that they previously thought were the right thing to do through the kinds of levers they used are increasingly being challenged. And I think it's interesting, and I think perhaps just alludes to what you said about your Secretary of State. I've had a number of conversations with our Secretary of State where his question is, why is the state doing this at all? Why? I'm not interested about who does it or where. Why is it being done? And I think if I had a bit of advice to colleagues, that's the question you should keep asking yourself. And don't say, don't for goodness sake give the answer because the state has always done it, because that's not a good answer. In fact, that's actually quite a bad answer, arguably, that you're only doing it because it's always been done, rather you're doing it because we think it's really necessary.
But I mean, I've got a very similar experience. We do all the big contracts for the rail companies. So there is a way of doing this. We've been doing it for a long time. It includes also buying some of the trains you actually use. So the government is buying rolling stock. If you ask people the question why we're doing this, it's not actually because it's always been done, but quite a sophisticated argument about why, given the landscape and value for money, this is the right answer. Yes. And the trick is not thinking that all of that logic is necessarily going to be accepted by the Secretary of State, because he's asking, I run through all this complicated argument, well, we thought about it, value for money, incentives, and his immediate reaction is, well, hang on a minute, it all seems wrong, think again.
Yeah, and I think it sounds as if your Secretary of State and my Secretary of State think quite alike in these matters. Even if you put up an argument that says, well, it must make better sense, should it, to aggregate up spending decisions, you have to challenge that as well, because the view of our Secretary of State is that he thinks that's often a mantra rather than always demonstrated by the evidence. So, for example, in much, much more significant devolution of funding, even greater than what we already are used to in this country, is anticipated. And while some people might say, oh, but that's going to mean every single school is going to buy its own photocopier or whatever. Well, that actually happens at the moment, but his view is that's the right thing to do. And even if there are some, as it were, inefficient decisions at the margins, the general benefit is created by ensuring that all the decisions and all the funding is determined by those folks who are closest to the action. Head teachers, school governors in the case of schools. So you're absolutely right. Don't just assume an argument you think will play well with the current administration necessarily plays well. I think there's a lot of going back to first principles. I don't know about you, but I'm actually finding it incredibly refreshing.
It is.
Because it is pushing you to go back and think again and argue from first principles and actually accept, we might not always have got this right in the past.
And I guess that the extent to which we should be encouraging everyone in the room to sort of legitimise hard questions about the status quo is exactly where it needs to be, because these aren't conversations that ministers are just having with us. Junior ministers are having it with other staff. The thing cascades down the system. So all the points I was making previously about spending is in the same box. In the current climate, you are allowed to think really quite differently about everything you've inherited, and if you think it's wrong, put your hand up and say, I think. Yeah. Can I come back to just a different dimension of sort of localism? So you've come back again to say just then, well, the most important thing is to push all this down and let people closest to the front line. What do you then do if you are worried about something like standards or something like vulnerable people? How do you think your Secretary of State squares that circle in a world in which things are pushed down to a multiplicity of different people?
Well, I think Our experience would be quite similar to a number of colleagues here. You have to have a degree of regulation or inspection. Although, again, don't just take for granted what you've done previously, because I think our Secretary of State would argue that that had all become too burdensome and overwhelming. He would argue very strongly that you do need measures of success, and you do need some way of inspecting or regulating that. That should be light touch. And this is the crucial point, I think, Robert, that addresses the question you asked, you do still have and should have a reserve power of intervention. But that should be in extremis. And I think his critique of the previous administration would be that it tried to get itself involved in too many places, and that actually sapped initiative. And if you actually gave more information out and you were more transparent and you gave more responsibility down to the individual institution, then those institutions that might be considered to be coasting will have the chill winds of public exposure, and they'll not be able just to say it. But what the government doesn't then start doing is devising 101 programmes from Whitehall to intervene in all of these schools. But there is a recognition in local government to do with child safeguarding, to do with school standards and failing schools. And there is a recognition there still will be a reserve power and there will be ways of intervening. But it's going to feel much less burdensome to the outside world than it might have been the case previously. I think the other thing that's probably just worth opening up here, Robert, is what we actually mean by localism. I think we've got to be very careful that we don't think that localism always means local government. And I think that is something where we just need to be clear. Some people have said to us, well, are you not inconsistent in your department? And is the government generally not inconsistent about local government? On the one hand, it's saying more power to local authorities. And on the other hand, through, for example, this Academies Bill going through Parliament, which in a sense enables greater freedom from schools apart from local government, you're taking power away from local government. I don't think actually it's incoherent to say the government's decision about where localism lies will vary subject matter to subject matter. So it seems to be quite consistent to say for most decisions relating to schools, those will be made at the level of the individual school. And local government's role will not be as active as it might be, for example, in other areas to do, in our case, say with the provision for children with complex special needs, where you do expect local government perhaps to have an even more active role than has been the case. So I don't think we should just assume localism means local government. And I think the instincts of our ministers are to enable as far as possible the local institution, the school, the college, the children's centre, to be the locus of decision making, because that way you're more likely to drive improvement, and also you're more likely to make it clearer to parents and others who use those services where responsibility lies.
Okay. Last question, then I'm going to let other people ask questions. If you go down that course, though, where does that leave things that we used to do sort of across departments? So in our two cases, under the banner of wanting to promote health and tackle obesity, we were trying to make sure that children walked and took a bike to school.
Absolutely.
An overarching sort of thought to be given to schools through this top-down mechanism. Now, in a world in which people are getting on and doing schools, do we just hope that if they think walking is a good idea, they do, and the NHS picks up the obesity bill if they don't?
Well, I think that's a really good question. To some extent, the nudge techniques that you talked about have been applied in our area already, but actually sometimes it's more than being nudge, it's been quite directive. And we can think, for example, of school meals, nutritional standards. We can think of some of the actions that have been taken regarding what should be sold in schools in terms of kinds of things that people eat and drink. We can think of the work that we did together, and I think that's unresolved. I mean, I think from our point of view, our colleagues will still want to talk about safety on the roads outside schools. We'll be anxious about that. We'll be anxious about sustainable transport. We'll be anxious about ensuring that children as far as possible, young people as far as possible, don't have to always rely on mum and dad's transport to get to school. All of those things have got to matter to us at a macro level. I think we could say most schools would be interested in those issues as well. Mm-hmm. The question is, how do you connect up the sort of national aspiration to do these things for the public good with the local institution's ability to make a change? So if I'm Sleepy Hollow Primary School, I don't actually have the power to arrange for the roads configuration outside my school to be different to address some safety concerns. I need others to assist me and help me. And I think some of the questions, those questions about what you do on collective effort, are going to be still to be resolved. I'll just give a couple of other examples. I mean, school music services, not just what children are taught at school in their own by their own teachers or music specialists, but what about the collective effort, you know, where you get children in a local area to play in bands or orchestras and so on. In the late 90s, mid to the late 90s, all of that money was devolved down to individual schools on the grounds that surely the schools will buy that back in and they'll all share a collective aim of having orchestras and bands and so on. What happened? They all collapsed. And then the previous government decided to put some additional funding in to enable that kind of collective effort to continue beyond what happened in individual schools. Now, you might think that was a good thing to do, but it was done, Robert, in a time of rising budgets. It might be harder, and whatever we think of some of those collective goals and goods, it might be that on balance, ministers say, sorry, schools, colleges, they know best, and if they choose not to buy into that collective effort, so be it.
Okay. Well, for somebody who's watched small children scrape away at a violin, I'm not entirely sure that it's a loss, but we'll see. Right, look, you've heard us talk now for quite a while, me on my own and then in conversation. We have about 15, 20 minutes to pick up any questions you want to ask us. I suggest we do this by sort of taking 2 or 3 questions at a time, because it just helps the people with the microphones. So if anybody wants to sort of stick their hands up, we'll take the first 3 and try and answer those.
Right under you, Robert. Is the lady there?
Where are we? I'm sorry, right. There's one down here, please. It's kind of 2 others while we're at it. There's somebody in the middle there. A third one. Right over there at the back. You're going to give fantastic exercise to the microphone holders if this is the distribution. Right. Sadie here first, please.
I'm B.C. Rednam from Treasury. It's just a comment on the 4 kind of spending, how it's my money spending on me.
Yes.
I, as a finance profession, think that all civil servants, I encourage all my business managers to think as though it's their own business. We are the taxpayers, we are the consumers. Mm-hmm. Therefore, it is my money spending on mine rather than others' money spending on others. So we can't bring the deficit reduction down if every one of us think our budget as my own money. That will actually encourage more of reduction without causing pain.
I quite agree with you. I quite agree with you. It's quite a hard thing to get done consistently. Here, Peter.
Question for David, really. You talked about the big society. You also happened to mention in passing that there were a number of vacancies for school governors across the country. Do you think that there's evidence that there is sufficient people with sufficient leisure time on their hands, bearing in mind that we in Britain work the longest hours in Europe, to actually staff up the big society?
Should we just do the third one as well, and then we'll...
My question was just about, in a society where we're going to be having more localism, what do you think people's reaction about this sort of postcode lottery, which is a very sort of fashionable way of talking about that, will be? What do you think people say about that?
Oh, splendidly, these are both for David.
Oh, thank you, Robert. I think it's an absolutely reasonable question to do with the big society. The evidence has been, of course, that whilst there are vacancies in school governing bodies, in the main, over the past 20 years since the powers of governors really increased, we have, across the country, been able to staff them up. The difficulties we tend to have, and this is in itself an issue, are areas of more social disadvantage, where it's quite difficult to sometimes encourage parents, and some schools go to heroic lengths to do that. And I think there is evidence that that's still not fully addressed. I think the issue, and perhaps you may be alluding more to the free schools where people are being encouraged to set up their own institutions. Well, I suppose the most important thing to say, first of all, is this is a permissive environment. People are not going to be dragged off the streets and forced to set up their own school. And we don't quite know yet how this will pan out. You might just be interested to know that there have been a very significant, into 4 figures now, inquiries about setting up free schools. And, you know, I wasn't sure what to expect. I genuinely wasn't sure what to expect on the free school side. A lot of interest. Now, some of that will just be interest at a very high level, but I don't think we should underestimate the amount of interest there might be, and that will take quite a commitment from people. And you're absolutely right, and I think that will be one of the calculations that people are making if they're thinking about setting up a free school. Am I really going to have time to do this? So I think that's open. But what I'm wanting to guard against, and I'm speaking entirely for myself, not for anybody else, is I have to guard against the scepticism that, well, it won't happen. I might just think that because I'm a civil servant and I work and I work on behalf of the state and in the state. Why mightn't? I might be wrong. There might be lots of people out there who want to do this, so we have to guard against our scepticism. Postcode lottery.
So just before we go on to that, I mean, the other thought that strikes me about it is that I think part of the sort of the deeper philosophy of the government is it's precisely because we got into the habit of thinking the state's going to fix it, that everybody else thinks it's somebody else's problem. And it comes back to your point about, you know, schools wanting, you know, road safety measures outside. I mean, that must be the council's problem. Yep. It's not a sort of, hang on, this is my community, what would I have to do about it? Yeah. So I mean, it's a very big punt that this could happen, which I think is why, you know, you might get a degree of sort of, I wonder if. But there is a corresponding philosophy here, which actually we are missing something at the bottom end of the spectrum. Absolutely. And that's what a lot of this is about. Sorry.
Yeah, I just going to say in postcode lottery, well, that illustrates the problem, you know. Why, oh, why do we have all of this, you know, bland, universal, nothing's different anywhere? And then why, oh, why do we have this postcode lottery where it's different in Bognor to what it is in Blackpool? I sense that this government is, I think it would be too, maybe I can't say they're more relaxed about that, but I do think they accept a bit more that you will get greater variation. Because after all, if you're trying to ginger up systems the way in which we've been talking about, are you not bound to get more variation? But here you play the transparency card, don't you? You say, well, why is it the case then in Bognor as opposed to Blackpool that things are better or worse? And therefore, you know, you accept the variation in the first place, but you assume that sort of power from below will keep improving and bring people up to a particular and better standard, then again move it up further. But I don't know, I mean, you might see this as well, but I sense that our ministers are, that's not a question they've been asking me. They've not been saying, oh my goodness, we're going to have a postal code lottery out of this. That has not been a
I sense the same thing, rather like one of the answers to your previous questions. I'm really interested in what it's going to feel like in year 3.
Yeah.
A lot of these things are sort of rather more obvious in week 8. Yeah. And quite where that will be thereafter, I don't know. I mean, it's going to be quite an interesting journey. Right, and somebody else has a
my question is this, but before I say my question, I think it's right to say that the civil service or the public sector has got a lot of media attention at the moment. First was the talk about the pay freeze, and now it's about the pension reform. My question is this: how do we intend to continue to motivate staff in the midst of all these changes and negativism around?
Okay. Can I just take 2 more while we're at it? There's one right in the middle here. Anyone? Another one? Can't quite see hands. There's the lady here in the red card. Yeah.
David talked about the concept of empowerment down to local level, so that head teachers will know what personnel they need to run their school and cover the situation with children with special needs. How do you square that with sort of rumours or headlines in the papers that there's going to be a total cull of teaching assistants?
My question, it's a question for David, which is, we've heard a lot in the last couple of days about efficiency and particularly about how we procure and achieve economies of scale. With the localism agenda of free schools, how do you think you're going to go about funding efficiently at that sort of local level?
Okay, do you want to make a start?
Well, you can do the motivation of staff ones because I'll do the other two. Well, that's fair. I'm doing two. He's doing one. Well, the teaching assistants point is a really interesting one because, of course, that is, in a sense, the outcome of both national policy direction and local choice. By that I mean that the previous government had moved to a position where it was actively stimulating the number of teaching assistants, partly through just the additional money that had gone into the education system in recent years, and also it was doing it on the basis of an agreement with the teachers' unions, all of them except one, about cover being provided on an occasional basis by teaching assistants. There was a sort of national direction and an encouragement to do it. Now, you're right, actually, at the local level, there's been a massive expansion in the number of non-teaching staff working in schools, and that's entirely local choice. Now, if you then think, well, where are we now? The Secretary of State's view would be that if we are heading into tougher times, those decisions about spending will be made at school level. And it will be a choice for individual schools about where they best think they're getting value for money. So is it better for them to carry on employing more non-teaching staff, because that actually supports not just children with special needs, but provides support for other children, provides more general support? Or is it better to cut back quite hard on teaching assistants to protect your core teaching staff? But that's a sort of either-or choice. Then the other choice is, well, where do you place staffing compared to the maintenance of your buildings, compared to enrichment activities? The point is, these will all be local choices to be made. The statutory responsibilities will remain in relation to, for example, children with special educational needs. But that has been the case in the previous administration's time, that it is for schools to decide how best to use the money that they've got to provide the services that they're required to provide. The thing that's difficult is that all that we've seen, teaching assistants and lots of other things, have come at a time of plenty. The tough decisions are yet to come, and I think this will be a big test. But I think what the press is doing is speculating that if budgets are going to be tighter, the first place schools will look is non-teaching assistants, because there's been such a massive growth in that cadre of folks working in schools. I think procurement issue is a really interesting one. In a sense, we've got that situation at the moment, because most of the vast majority of procurement decisions are made at the individual school level. And at various times, and you'll all have been subject to this to a greater or less extent, folks from the Treasury will come along, and often independent experts will be appointed, and they'll come along and they'll say, can you just explain to me, Mr. Bell, why is it that you've got 20,000 plus individual purchasing units, i.e. schools, making all these decisions for themselves? And I say, well, that's local management. And we're not going to start taking that decision-making away from schools. So what we have to do is nudge. And what we've done is lots of nudges. We've put online the best prices. We've generated an agreement amongst suppliers to create consortia arrangements. We've encouraged schools to come together with other schools to procure not just as one, but as many. And those are classic nudge techniques, where you don't require behaviour in a particular way, but you put incentives in. You provide encouragement. You provide lots of data. You make transparent the worst price that a school has ever paid for a photocopier against the best price that a school has ever paid. And I And I feel that we've got to do more on this. I think one last thing on this, if I might, Robert. I think one of the problems is that when these efficiency experts come along and tell me, if they only just had one single contract for all computers in all schools across the country, they are assuming that that is the most effective way of doing it. It arguably is the case that it's more efficient to do that way, although I think I'd even challenge that, to have one single contract to buy computers for all 20,000 schools. But, arguably it is more effective to allow the decision about which computer to be made at the local level, because the school knows best about what suits its particular circumstances in relation to the pupils that it serves. So, I think we shouldn't just take for granted in all circumstances there. Now, you might say, well, is that not an argument for not doing this sort of stuff that's been talked about at the centre of government? I think the centre of government is more, however, like the sort of multinational company with lots of holding companies than the school system where you have 20,000 constitutionally independent entities. Part of the illogicality, one might say, at the centre of government is that, in a sense, we are one at the centre of government, but sometimes we don't make the right decisions because we all procure separately.
Okay, let me try the, where's the lady, the motivation lady? She's going. You're going to the motivation. Okay, let me make some observation on this. I mean, we spent most of this session basically talking about sort of the stuff that ministers worry about. I think it would be fair to say that my colleagues and I spend about at least as much time as we appear to have spent on this rather tricky question about exactly how we're going to get people through the agenda that we've got in front of us. Let me make 3 observations, first of all, around the sort of the different strands of that before I come to the question of what you do about it. First of all, there's an element of what's going on at the minute, which is the simple consequence of the fact that we are very short of cash. So when ministers stand up and say they regret that there is a pay freeze or that they are changing the severance arrangements, they're doing that with one eye on the fact that actually there is an arithmetic here, and actually the arithmetic one way or another has got to be resolved. And certainly, I've heard ministers say, and I think there's a perfectly legitimate reason for thinking this, that things to do with what you do with pay are clearly going to have an effect on jobs as well, in terms of how many more jobs you would otherwise lose. So some of this is actually a piece of arithmetic which we need to be clear about. However, and this is the bit that's more tricky, because we are working in a sort of public goldfish bowl, because we're in a political space, the way in which virtually all of that gets reported is almost always extremely hostile. It is a depressing view to sort of go through the press cuttings every morning, not just about civil service stuff, but actually if you just see what people write about transport day in, day out, actually, you have to have quite a good sort of a good constitution to do it. So I would distinguish in my mind, first of all, between why things are being done, and secondly, how they're being reported. The third thing I think is worth pointing out is that for many of us, actually, this is a journey which actually we don't quite know where everything is going right at the moment. So we're in a position of some uncertainty. Now, what does that mean for me and how I might then go about it? I mean, a couple of things, really. First of all, and I shall be doing this with my senior civil service today and with the rest of my staff tomorrow, actually at least taking people through what I think I know about where the journey is going to be. What is the likely charting a course for the next 6 months, 12 months, in terms of who's going to be doing what and why. So it's information and trying to be as open as possible where I know it is point one. Point two, I think I would keep going back to this. I mean, there is a reason why I'm in government, which is because actually I believe what we do is important. I did spend 2 years with Guinness, the brewers. Fantastic time. If you like beer in particular, we were taking the company car and backing it up to the brewery, filling it up with beer all the time. The reason I came back from Guinness, despite all of that, was because ultimately I didn't really think that whether my company sold more beer was more important than whether the competition sold more beer. What we actually do, day in, day out, really is important. It's important to millions of people. That's the thing which we are going to have to hold on to, because that's the thing which I suspect many of you are here for, and will still be true for whatever shape of civil service comes beyond us. So the things that I will want to be doing in terms of motivation is making sure people realise what it is that we are about, and seeking in the process to address the uncertainty and be clear as possible about where things are going. That is inevitably going to be a bumpy ride for some months to come. And the best that we can do, I think, is to be open with you about what we know when we know and give some shape to it. That's my answer, but I don't see why you shouldn't be asked whether you have a better one.
Oh, I certainly don't.
I'm conscious of time. Can we just see if there's any other questions people want to ask? Because if not, we will finish. Anybody else got a hand up? Since I can see people leaving, and my guess is that actually there's other sessions starting. Okay, let's finish now. Can I, first of all, thank you for coming? Can I thank David for joining me on this? Can I remind you that the sort of things that we've been doing in the space of an hour, we are trying to lay on to give people more time to think this through in the autumn. So please will you look out for the things that we'll be putting out under the banner of the sort of the policy profession and the core learning programme. If you have things that you particularly want us to be thinking about over and above the things that we've been talking about, do let me know. Drop me an email, write to the policy support team that work for me, and it will be at the doors now. But thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.